And we're recording. So today I'm recording the session live and leaving room for questions. And this is another live review presentation like I did for the midterm. And this lecture is going to outline the format of the final and recap a number of the important topics from the lectures from before the midterm. And I'm having another review session on Wednesday where I'll be covering the post-midterm material. And again, this class is really broad, but I hope that the review presentations help you tie together some of the concepts and make the overall scope of the class a bit less random. And as I've mentioned, and as you can probably ascertain from the nature of this lecture, material from before the midterm is fair game. I'm going to talk about how much of it is going to be on the final and give some examples of questions that might help. I'm going to give some examples of questions I might ask on the exam that will link concepts from the units earlier in the class from before the midterm to those after the class. There's a reminder that there is a reading assignment still open and due. That is due Sunday, March 14th at 11:59 p.m. And that is the write-up on an academic article about Antarctica. So either a science journal article or possibly also a history or social science article if that appeals to you more. But that is also Sunday, March 14th at 11:59 Pacific Standard Time. That is also when extra credit assignments are due. If you have any notes from presentations you've seen or hikes you've done and haven't turned them into a write-up yet, go ahead and do that and get those to me ASAP. And I will have some more information about some potential extra credit opportunities this week. I'm waiting on some emails from the department and seeing if I can access any previous recordings, because I know some people are wondering about that. If you have any questions about missing assignments or about quiz results or anything like that, Sunday is kind of the deadline to do that. Now, if there's something that hasn't been graded for any reason, I know the TAs are doing their best to get through assignment number 1 and the questions from the second quiz. If there's anything that they don't get to, then that's different. But in general, if you want to sort of check on how you've done on past assignments and you have questions for me, try to get those to me before Sunday, because after that, it's going to be finals week. And very soon after finals week, I will have to submit grades. And there's not a lab due this week or next week. And likewise, the TAs are not having their regular office hours this week. You can meet them by appointment if you need, and you can also email them, but they won't be around for regular office hours this week or next week. And as for the final itself, it's going to be open all of finals week, essentially. It's going to be open from Monday through Friday. There's a small chance I might be able to open it earlier. I will see. And if you specifically need to get it done earlier, like if you have travel plans or something, I don't know what, but go ahead and shoot me an email right away. It is much easier for me to open it earlier than to extend the deadline, unfortunately, because the deadline to submit grades will come up very soon after this, unfortunately. And during finals week, I will be around for office hours. I'm not going to be doing a formal review presentation during finals week, but on Monday, March 15th and Wednesday, March 17th, I will still be around for office hours from 3:30 to 5:30 p.m. using this regular link. So you can still reach me, and feel free to send me email questions. Again, don't send me questions while you're taking the exam, obviously, but you can still send me emails up to the point where you take the exam. So any questions about this before I move on to exam format? Okay, I'll take that as a no.
I just wanted to ask, will there be a...
Yes, there will be a study guide. I will put that out in the next couple of days, hopefully tonight. And I'll talk about a little bit about that on the next slide, but there will be a very similar study guide to the midterm that recaps terms from after the midterm. You should still refer to the study guide from prior to the midterm just to refresh yourself on what terms were important for that. I wouldn't spend quite as much time on it as studying the study guide and the slides for the post-midterm material, because as I'll mention, 3/4 of the exam is going to be based on post-midterm material. About 1 in 4 questions, or 25% of the exam, will be based on pre-midterm material. So the final exam will open on Monday, March 15th at midnight. It'll close on Friday, and it's, sorry, my cat got on the keyboard again. And it's going to be largely based on post-midterm. Oh, sorry, I jumped a slide without noticing that. there we go. It's going to be very similar in structure to the midterm. It'll be 50 multiple choice or true or false questions with 10 on each page of what is essentially a long Gaucho space quiz, and you will be able to go back and check your questions also. You don't have to move on and then you won't be able you're able to go back and edit your response to or answer questions that you'd skipped after going from one page to the next. I just have it on multiple pages to make it slightly more broken into segments and a little more manageable, I hope. And you'll have 75 minutes to do it, which is the amount of time you'd have in a regular in-person class. So the final is not longer than the midterm. The final is about the same in length and also in the amount it counts towards your grade as the midterm was. And you may begin your attempt at any time within this window, but again, you only get one attempt, so don't wait until the last minute. And I also, again, if you have issues that cause your attempt to be interrupted, send me a message right away so that I can figure that out. And that's one reason to take it on the early side if possible. It is closed notes and closed book, so don't reference your notes or the lecture slides or anything like that while you're taking it. And as for this week's review, today's review session is, I'm actually to a big extent using similar slides to the slides that I used when I did the midterm review because it's recapping the same material, and I'll just do a brief run through of some of the important concepts and also some questions I might ask. And then lecture 18 on Wednesday, March 10th will be a review of the material we've covered since the midterm, and there won't be any new material on it. So as I mentioned, 75% of the questions on the exam are going to be about lectures 10 through 16, the lectures that I've posted since the midterm. And you also want to make sure that you have seen any videos and read any reading that I've given you since the midterm. Now, if you have not seen something or read it, go ahead and make sure you do that. If you already have seen the clips and done the readings and taken notes, I don't necessarily recommend spending a lot of time rewatching those, especially if it's at the expense of time to study the slides. Because in general, I don't ask a lot of questions, especially multiple choice questions about specific things in the movies or the readings. They're there to reinforce concepts, and so I might mention them in the hint to a question, and it might make it easier for you if you've seen the movies, like if you've seen the clips of Encounters at the End of the World and Antarctica, A Year on the Ice, and read the Shackleton reading. I think that might be it. There might be one other reading that I'm blanking out on. And as for stuff from before the midterm, do not worry about the readings and the movies from anything from before the midterm. Just focus on key terms from the midterm study guide and the slides themselves for when you do the studying. And I will be posting a study guide on the new material, on the post-midterm material very soon. I'm aiming to get that done tonight. And so that's basically the format of the exam. Any questions on that or on percentages or anything of the sort before I move on? Okay then, cool. So if you saw the midterm summary slides, this is what we covered prior to the midterm: geography, climate, geology and plate tectonics, which led into a fossil and geologic history. And then we talked about Antarctica's modern wildlife. And a number of these have connections to material that we've covered since. Obviously, we talked about in the human history of Antarctica how improved understanding of latitude and longitude, particularly being able to find longitude at sea, was one factor that made exploration of dangerous regions like the sea around Antarctica safer. And so that's one possible connection that could come up. We learned about longitude and latitude when we learned about geography, and then that system of measurement, like sailors navigating, that becomes relevant again when we learn about the exploration of Antarctica. Then also there's going to be a lot of connections between what we learned about when talking about Antarctica's climate, just in general, like talking about it without factoring climate change into it. And we've learned about topics such as how melting sea ice and warming seas could affect Antarctic bottom water formation, and how Antarctica has gotten even windier because of the increased energy in the ocean, providing energy for stronger storms and the like. And so going back to the geography, we learned that Antarctica is cold, dry, windy, and high on average, and that a lot of that is a consequence of Antarctica's latitude and of the tilt of Earth's axis, as well as effects of oceanic and atmospheric circulation. We learned about latitude and longitude and how those are used to make maps, and then delved into some important geographic features related to Antarctica, like talking about East versus West Antarctica and their separate ice sheets, the transantarctic mountains, which we later learned in geology were caused by uplift from rifting, and the difference between the geographic South Pole, where Earth's magnetic field meets its terminus, basically, and the geographic South Pole, which is just located at the southernmost point on Earth, because those aren't the same. The magnetic pole wanders, the geographic South Pole obviously doesn't. And those come up later, of course, in the exploration unit, because a number of the expeditions were launched either specifically to find or chart the magnetic South Pole, like the French expedition, the Dumont-D'Urville expedition, or the Mawson expedition, the Australian Antarctic expedition, in which the dude almost fell into a crevasse trying to come back from it. And then people tried to reach the geographic South Pole as well, like the race between Amundsen and Scott, and also Shackleton's second Antarctic visit was an attempt to reach the South Pole as well. Not his most famous one, but and the question I threw in here is one that might use a hint related to the post-midterm material to emphasize a pre-midterm concept. So the question is, the Belgian Antarctic expedition was the first expedition to overwinter south of the Antarctic Circle, and the Antarctic Circle is what kind of line? So what would the correct answer be among these? Anybody want to take a stab at it? At what the answer might be? There we go, in the chat. Yes. Excellent. Jay and Elizabeth both got that right. It is a line of latitude. And the hint there is that the important thing is that, remember, the Antarctic Circle is a line of latitude that indicates land to the south. So the land to the south of the Antarctic Circle experiences full darkness at least once a year. And the hint in here is that, okay, latitude measures distance north or south, and oh right, these people were south of the Antarctic Circle, so the Antarctic Circle must be a line of latitude, not longitude, which measures distance east or west. And then of course, these other ones are just in there, like they're terms we've used, but not really relevant to this. Equilibrium lines are related to glaciers, not to measuring location on a map. Contour lines are about telling you elevation. And then thermohaline is just in there for me to throw a fancy word in that's from a totally different part of the class, and hopefully you'll just realize right away, okay, that's not actually relevant to this. So I don't throw in a lot of trick or joke answers, but sometimes I throw in answers that sound like they could be legit scientific concepts, but then if you've studied and come across those terms before, you'll realize, oh, that's related to ocean circulation, not actually to geography, really. So any lingering questions related to geography, or questions about what kind of questions might be on the exam related to this, or the like? Okay, so we also learned quite a bit about climate, and climate, there will definitely be at least some climate questions because we talked about climate change during our last week of new material. And when we first started learning about climate, we began with intro material, like learning about solar radiation and how different latitudes experience different amounts of solar radiation, basically, and how that is part of what keeps Antarctica cold. We talked about the structure of the atmosphere, the different layers of it, and then we delved into the ozone layer, which is present in the stratosphere, and how the prevalence of CFCs and nitrous gases from airplanes has caused ozone depletion, and how that's been really concentrated in Antarctica. For a number of reasons, like the cold temperatures in Antarctica, the fact that the polar vortex collects and concentrates the gases that destroy ozone around the South Pole, and because also these compounds that destroy ozone are really long-lived. We learned about how the southern lights form in one of the uppermost layers of the atmosphere from the interaction between Earth's magnetic field and charged particles, aka solar wind. And then we talked about why Antarctica is so cold. The high latitude, meaning that sunlight reaches it less directly, and then the fact that the Earth's axis is tilted, that puts Antarctica in total darkness for part of the year, and means that for a good part of the year, there's just no solar radiation reaching it, period. And then you want to understand how atmospheric circulation is ultimately from there being too much solar radiation at the equator and too little at the poles, how overall the process helps bring energy towards the poles, and how Antarctica is a zone of high pressure, where the air in one of these atmospheric circulation cells is falling, and where you have cold, dry air, and the air pressure and circulation patterns being a big contributor as to why Antarctica is cold and dry. The air reaching Antarctica, especially right around the South Pole, is really, really dry. And how the high pressure contributes to Antarctica being so windy, especially via the high pressure, the wind, the air falling around the South Pole, and then gaining speed as it makes its way down the glaciers, down the ice sheet. Because the ice sheet, remember, is dome-shaped. It accumulates most at the center of the continent, so it's higher there. And the air is already really dense, and it ends up moving a lot faster under the force of gravity as it flows down the ice sheet from the center of the continent towards the edges. And those are the katabatic winds that I lingered on a bit. And we talked about ocean circulation and how wind causes surface currents, like the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, and then how ocean water also circulates through the seas on the basis of density differences, and how Antarctica is actually one very important place where that happens, where the seawater gets cold and extremely salty, in part from sea ice formation, and that causes it to sink, bringing down nutrients and oxygen to the deep ocean that spreads throughout the oceans elsewhere, and plays an important role in distributing those throughout the world. And one place where you might expect to see connections with post-midterm material here is climate change, and in the question here, I've brought up Antarctic bottom water. Antarctic bottom water came up in lecture 16 when we talked about possible consequences of the loss of sea ice and the warming of the oceans. So these consequences here are basically consequences of climate change or other environmental disasters in Antarctica, and which one of these possible choices is going to affect Antarctic bottom water formation? Yep, the answer is B. Fantastic. Because Antarctic bottom water forms because sea ice forms. Sea ice doesn't take the salt with it, and it leaves the remaining liquid water with a lot more salt in it, and that makes it dense and helps cause it to sink. And with less sea ice forming, that is inhibiting or at least affecting the rate at which Antarctic bottom water forms. As for the rest of these, salp are, remember, they're a type of creature that is proliferating because you have more open water. They're these free-swimming sea squirts, not related to Antarctic bottom water formation, really, related to the loss of sea ice, but they don't have anything to do with bottom water formation. Adelaide penguins declining doesn't have anything to do with that. Strengthening of winds, that's one case where you might think, okay, how could that relate? But in reality, that isn't going to affect thermohaline circulation that much. Really, that's not going to, the wind strengthening, the Antarctic bottom water, it does form in part because the winds are helping push sea ice away from the coast, and that causes more sea ice to form. And hypothetically, strengthening winds could actually speed up Antarctic bottom water formation, but I didn't really talk about that, and it's not really a clear cut, this does that. And then you have the Antarctic ozone hole, which is not directly related to climate change. It's related to another human-caused fiasco. So anyway, that's an example question that could connect pre and post midterm material. So any questions on climate-related material before I move on from that? All right then, so the next part was geology. We learned about continental drift, and we learned about the structure of the Earth, how it's made of different tectonic plates. We went over how fossils, the shapes of continents, glacial evidence, and mountain belts indicated that the continents had moved, how seafloor spreading was discovered, how divergent plate boundaries were discovered. People realized that new crust was produced at these seafloor spreading centers and that it was recycled in trenches at subduction zones. And we talked about how the cycle of ridge push and slab pull, as well as mantle convection, drives this process. And we focused on the different types of plate boundaries a bit. And in regards to plate tectonics, one thing you definitely want to review are the different types of plate boundaries. So here's one example question that I could ask you about plate tectonics. I mentioned subduction just now, and subduction is when you have one plate going under and sinking into the mantle and ultimately recycling material back into the mantle. And subduction creates volcanoes. Actually, it's one mechanism that creates volcanoes. So among these different types of plate boundaries, divergent plate boundaries, and then a convergent plate boundary where you have two oceanic plates, a convergent plate boundary where you have one plate that's ocean material and one made of continental material, a convergent boundary where you have two continents colliding, and then a hotspot. Which one of these would you not have volcanoes forming at? It's actually D in this case. So I talked about in the geology lecture how when two continents collide, they just build mountains and you don't get any subduction. And to a big extent, subduction is what causes volcanoes. You also find volcanoes at divergent plate boundaries at seafloor spreading, because remember that you have magma upwelling and making new crust. And a hotspot is not a type of plate boundary, but you get volcanoes there. So it's not a possible answer in that regard. Even though it's not a plate boundary, there's volcanoes, so it doesn't fit that. When you have two oceans, you get subduction. So that makes volcanoes. When you get an ocean and a continent, the ocean plate goes under the continental plate, and you get subduction and you get volcanoes. When you have two plates colliding that are made of both continental, neither of them can subduct because the continental material is so much less dense, and so you don't get volcanoes. And that's a question related to the different types of plate boundary that I might ask. And similarly, we went from plate tectonics to talking about the geologic and fossil history of Antarctica. We went through a summary of fossils in paleontology, learning about absolute versus relative dating, learning about how fossils are used to study Earth history. And we went from the formation of the East Antarctic Craton to the Great Oxidation Event, to the existence of cyanobacteria, to snowball Earth, and onto the Cambrian explosion and the appearance of most groups of modern animals. We talked about the Carboniferous period and how Antarctica was covered in warm, steamy swamps that produced the coal that we know today then. And we talked about the Permian period, in which the ancestors of mammals dominated the land, including the land in Antarctica, and how the world was actually pretty cool then. There was a glacier in Antarctica then. And then the Permian extinction happened and wiped out most of that life, wiped out the vast majority of sea life. And after the Permian extinction, the Earth entered a much warmer period of climate, and that set the stage for reptiles, including dinosaurs, to dominate. And dinosaurs evolved near the end of the Triassic. At that point, Antarctica was part of Pangaea, which would mostly stay together for a lot of the dinosaur age. Mammals appear at the very end of the Triassic, like in the early part of the dinosaur age. And dinosaurs, we talked about some of the Antarctic dinosaurs and how they are related to and very similar to Australian dinosaurs in many cases, because those two continents were connected and were actually until very recently connected. Antarctica would actually not fully break off from Australia or any of the other continents until the middle of the age of mammals, long after most dinosaurs had gone extinct. And Antarctica has begun to look like its modern version, aka a borderline uninhabitable wasteland of ice and rock with no land animals larger than a midge. Since the Oligocene epoch, the middle of the age of mammals, when Antarctica drifted away from Australia and South America for good, and the Antarctic Circumpolar Current formed. And the example question here is one possible true or false question that connects a geologic event in Antarctica, aka the formation of coal during the Carboniferous and early Permian periods, with a concept we talked about in the second half of the course, aka the carbon cycle, and how different biological processes either release CO2 into the atmosphere or sequester it. And so coal in Antarctica formed from vast swamps during the Carboniferous and Permian periods. And the true or false part is this sequestered carbon dioxide. So is this true or false? The formation of coal sequestered carbon dioxide. Yes, this is true. Because remember that when fossil fuels form, they are converting CO2. The CO2 in the atmosphere gets taken up by plants. And when those plants die, they get buried before they decompose. And when they decompose, that's when CO2 gets released. But if they get buried before, they get converted into pure hydrocarbons by geologic pressure. So the formation of coal and oil actually takes CO2 out of the air, and that's what happened during the Carboniferous period. In fact, there is some research that connects the relative coolness of the Permian period and the formation of glaciers to somewhat with the formation of so much coal during the Carboniferous, taking so much CO2 out of the atmosphere. So that's one thing you can think about. It got colder after the period in which a lot of coal was forming, and to some extent that was actually related to CO2 being taken out of the atmosphere. So any questions about geology or Earth history? And again, a lot of the questions on pre-midterm stuff will have at least hints that relate to concepts that you've learned since the midterm, because one thing I'm trying to do is derive as many connections as I can and connect material from different parts of the course as well as I can, because I do realize this class comes across as very random with just a lot of material. But to what extent I can make it less random, I will do that. Cool. And then before the midterm, the last subject we went over was ecology and wildlife, aka the modern wildlife of Antarctica, as opposed to the past life that we learned about from the fossil record. And land life in Antarctica pretty much went extinct after the circumpolar current formed. It left just a few hardy arthropods, water bears, a couple of simple plants, and some extremophile bacteria behind. But the marine food web is a lot more diverse. We learned about how in the ocean, the autotrophs, aka the organisms that photosynthesize and make their own food, are largely the phytoplankton that live in the water, the microscopic algae that then krill, which are heterotrophs, aka they eat other organisms to survive. The krill then feed upon that phytoplankton, and the krill are fed upon by fish and squid and by seals and baleen whales. And not so much the whales, but then those organisms are eaten by seals and killer whales and penguins. And so phytoplankton and krill provide the basis of the Antarctic food web. Plankton, free-swimming organisms do that. Excuse me, not free-swimming, like floating in the water. If an organism is a plankton, it drifts in the open water without really being able to swim against the current much. And that's a biological lifestyle term, as opposed to a term that classifies them on their evolution, which is something I've had to learn over time. But we talked about the connection with sea ice and Antarctic ecosystems, how the microscopic algae spend the summer dormant, frozen in the sea ice or living underneath it, which actually provides a food source for krill. And then because there's so much sunlight in the summer, and because no photosynthesis happens in the winter because there's no energy to provide, there's no energy for that process to occur, there's just a bunch of unused nutrients from the winter that sit around in the ocean. So the summer is a biological productivity boom. The algae go into hyperdrive, the krill population explodes, and then whales migrate from elsewhere in the world to feed on that. The reason we see whales migrating up and down the coast of North America is because they're doing something similar. They're going between their breeding grounds around the equator and their feeding grounds in the Arctic, which experiences a similar productivity boom to what we see in Antarctica. And we talked about how many of the organisms have adapted, how fish have adapted to the cold by evolving glycerol proteins or getting large, and how penguins stay warm by a number of behavioral adaptations like huddling and using a tripod stance, and how physically they've evolved to have very streamlined feathers that do a good job of repelling the wind and the water, and how they have fat. Oops, sorry, my cat sat on that. How they have fat under their skin and how the fat keeps them warm, how fat also insulates swimming organisms like seals and whales and helps them not freeze to death in the Antarctic waters. So the question I have here is sort of a general question meant to get you to think about a distinction I've made a bunch of times, and it's that Antarctica doesn't have much in the way of terrestrial life or land-based life. And people sometimes get confused by that because penguins do some stuff on land. They lay their eggs on land and they spend some time on land. But why aren't they considered to be terrestrial animals? And I realize I just sort of gave away one of the potential answers, but yep, it's because they feed at sea. Their food source is is inside the ocean. It's the fish that depend on the krill. On land, they don't really feed at all. They plan their feeding cycle so that they feed and then can go long periods just relying on their fat reserves. They don't breed in the ocean. They don't lay their eggs there. And the fact that they're descended from marine life, everything is ultimately descended from marine life. Life originated in the oceans, so that doesn't really factor into it. And also penguins can't fly, but that doesn't have anything to do with them being land animals or not. So with questions related to pre-midterm material, I will be making them a bit less specific than you might have seen before when you took the midterm, because a lot of this material you have not reviewed heavily, and hopefully, and you'll want to spend more time reviewing material that we've covered since the midterm, but there will be some questions related to this material regarding general concepts and in places where there's a good connection to be made with post-midterm material. So I am now going to open it up for questions. I'm going to leave the recording on for a bit in case people are comfortable having their questions recorded. But remember that I will be doing a review session of the post-midterm material on Wednesday. So thank you for coming by to this, and I'm around for questions now.
Hi.
Hello.
I just wanted to ask real quick, are there any extra credit opportunities this week?
There's actually a.
Did you hear me?
Yes, I heard you. Can you hear me at all? There's a seminar happening on there's a seminar happening on Friday that I need.
Yeah, I can. I'm good.
My internet's misbehaving. There's a seminar happening on Friday actually, and I'll send an email out about that because that might work for some people who haven't been able to get to the Thursday colloquia. And I don't know if there's a colloquium happening this Thursday. Let me see actually. There may or may not be. I haven't haven't seen an email about that, but there's something happening on Friday that I will send an email out about. And I also will get back to you all regarding whether
Okay,
there's any
thank
other
you.
recordings that can be accessed. Actually, there's an email earlier I sent out. There's one of the seminars that didn't get recorded live because of some scheduling issues, and so they pre-recorded it, and I sent an email with the link to that a while back. So that's one that you can do easily without having to be at a lecture at a specific time, if you want to try for another extra credit. So shoot me an email if you have trouble finding that, but it's in the Peachmail emails I've sent out.
I also had a question pertaining to the extra credit. I went to the colloquium last Thursday and it was like extremely confusing. I don't even know if I can like even describe what was happening there. Should I just like skip out on that colloquium?
Well, it's up to you. I recognize that these colloquia they're presenting graduate level or postdoctoral level research. And they tend to assume that people have they're speaking for an audience that they assume has all had intro geology and are all a bunch of earth science majors, which is not necessarily the case for you all. There is, if you do want to try to write about it, I don't know what, if this is last week, if you can't find it, send me an email, but in the slides somewhere or in one of my past emails, there should be the flyer from the colloquium that has a summary of the talk they gave. And at the very least, you can start with that you can write about what the author's intentions were, and you can write about whether the talk seemed to reflect much of what was in the summary, the abstract. But you don't have to write about that particular one if you have a hard time with it. But it's also completely okay to talk about what you didn't understand, like specific, if you have notes that are like, okay, I don't really follow this, it's okay to write about that, because it's actually rather enlightening for me to see what concepts from these lectures from these colloquia don't make sense to students, because that's actually kind of a useful teaching tool for me. So hopefully that helps a little bit. But shoot me an email if you need to track down any of those summaries. And I apologize if I'm not catching everything. And yes, I have heard about an anime called A Place Further Than the Universe. There's a couple of screenshots from it you can see scattered throughout the slides, actually. I've used it a couple of times. Anyway, I'm going to end the recording on that note, but I'll still be around for a couple of hours to answer questions. So good luck studying, and remember that the next review session will be about post-midterm material.